There is a word that has lasted 2,500 years. A word that still carries weight, still conjures an image: soldiers, shields, fire, and iron discipline. The word is Sparta. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. A city in the southern reaches of ancient Greece, surrounded by mountains on nearly every side. Not a city of marble temples and grand colonnades, not like Athens, not like Corinth. Sparta was something different. Something quieter, and in its quietness, something far more unsettling. The Spartans left almost no written records of their own. They built almost nothing that survived. They did not write philosophy or plays or poetry in any great quantity. What they left behind was a legend, and like all legends, the reality beneath it is stranger, darker, and more human than the myth allows. For centuries, people have looked at Sparta and seen what they wanted to see. Military theorists saw a perfect war machine. Romantics saw noble sacrifice. Politicians saw discipline taken to its highest form. But the true Sparta, the one that existed in the valleys of Laconia, the one where real people were born and grew old and died, was something no one ever quite expected. It was a society built on a secret it could never speak aloud. A warrior culture that was, in many ways, terrified. A place where strength was worshipped and weakness destroyed, and yet where the strongest institution was not the army, but a silence enforced from birth. Tonight, we go there. Not to the Sparta of Hollywood films, not to the slow-motion shields and screaming kings. To the real place. The cold mountain air, the black broth, the rituals no one talks about, the women who were unlike any other women in the ancient world, and the boys who disappeared into a system so total it had no name for mercy. 77 facts. Each one a window into a world that thought it understood itself and that the world has misunderstood ever since. Get comfortable. Let's begin. Fact 1. Sparta was not its own name. The city we call Sparta called itself Lacedaemon. Sparta was the name of the settlement, but the state, the political entity, the thing that trained soldiers and dominated the Peloponnese, was Lacedaemon. When ancient writers referred to its people, they called them Lacedaemonians. The word Spartan, as we use it today, would have sounded slightly off to the very people it described. This is a small distinction, but it matters. Because the Sparta of legend, the icon, the brand, was already being shaped by outsiders, by Athenians and later Romans who needed a contrast to hold up against their own values. The name we chose for them was the name of a village. What they built was an entire world. Fact 2. The city had no walls. Athens had walls. Corinth had walls. Nearly every significant city in the ancient Mediterranean world protected itself behind stone fortifications. Sparta had none. Not because it forgot to build them or lacked the resources, but by deliberate choice, maintained for centuries. The reasoning, as Spartans explained it, was simple: a city's walls are its men. To build stone walls was to admit that your soldiers might fail. The Spartans would not make that admission. This choice sent a message to every neighboring city-state and to Sparta's own citizens. The absence of walls was itself a monument. It said that Sparta's defense rested entirely on the bodies of the men it trained from childhood, and that no other defense was needed or wanted. Fact 3. The Helots were the real foundation. Sparta's military culture rested on a foundation it never celebrated in public: the Helots. The Helots were a subject population, not quite slaves in the Roman sense, but something closer to serfs permanently bound to the land of Laconia and Messenia. They vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens, possibly by a ratio of 7 to 1, perhaps higher. They worked the fields that fed Sparta. They accompanied armies as support workers. Without them, Sparta could not have maintained its warrior class at all, because a Spartan citizen was forbidden from doing manual labor. His entire life was meant to be dedicated to warfare and preparation for warfare. The Helots made that possible. And the Spartiates knew it. Which is part of why they feared them so deeply. Fact 4. Sparta declared war on its own slaves every year. Each year, Sparta's ephors, the elected magistrates who shared power with the kings, formally declared war on the Helot population. This was not metaphorical. It was a legal declaration, repeated annually, that allowed Spartan citizens to kill Helots without incurring the religious pollution associated with murder. Under Greek religious law, killing a person without justification could bring divine punishment. The annual declaration solved this problem neatly. It meant that at any moment, a Spartan could kill a Helot and be within the law. The declaration was one part of a broader institution called the Krypteia, a system of organized, state-sanctioned terror designed to prevent Helot rebellion by keeping the subject population in a constant state of fear. Fact 5. The Krypteia was a secret police of teenage boys. The Krypteia was one of Sparta's most disturbing institutions, and one of its least discussed. Selected young men, those who showed exceptional ability, were sent out into the countryside at night with nothing but a knife. Their mission was to move silently, live off the land, and kill Helots. Particularly, they were to seek out and kill Helots who showed signs of strength, intelligence, or leadership, those who might one day organize resistance. The Krypteia served multiple purposes. It trained young Spartans in stealth, endurance, and killing without hesitation. It eliminated potential Helot leaders before they could rise. And it maintained a psychological atmosphere in which the Helot population could never feel safe after dark. It was a system of terror made routine. Fact 6. Spartan babies were examined at birth. The image is stark and has been repeated so many times it has almost lost its power to disturb. Spartan elders examining newborn children and deciding which ones would live. According to ancient sources, primarily Plutarch, infants were brought before a group of elders from the child's tribe shortly after birth. The elders examined the child. If it appeared sickly, malformed, or otherwise weak, it was taken to a place called the Apothetai, a chasm near Mount Taygetus, and left there to die. The healthy infants were returned to their mothers. Scholars debate how consistently this practice was applied, and Plutarch wrote centuries after the fact. But the institution, in some form, appears to have existed. Sparta did not simply train its citizens to be strong, it tried to ensure, from the first moments of life, that weakness never entered the system at all. Fact 7. Spartan mothers bathed newborns in wine. Before the elders ever saw a Spartan infant, the child had already undergone its first test. Spartan tradition held that newborns should be bathed not in water but in wine. The belief was that wine would reveal the child's constitution, that an epileptic or otherwise frail child would convulse or react badly to the wine bath, while a healthy child would be strengthened by it. Whether this practice was universal or consistent is uncertain. But it reveals something important about Spartan thinking, the belief that nature could be tested, that the body would reveal its own truth under pressure, and that the earliest moments of life were not for comfort but for assessment. The wine bath was not a ritual of welcome. It was the first examination. Fact 8. The agoge began at age 7. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and entered a state education system called the agoge. This was not a school in any modern sense. It was a total institution, a controlled environment designed to produce a specific kind of human being. Boys lived in groups called agelai, or herds. They slept on rushes they cut themselves from the riverbank. They were given inadequate food, deliberately, not because Sparta was poor, but because the system encouraged them to steal additional food to supplement their rations. If they were caught stealing, they were punished. Not for stealing, but for being caught. The agoge lasted until age 30. For more than 2 decades, a Spartan male's entire existence was shaped, controlled, and defined by this institution. Fact 9. Boys were punished for being caught, not for stealing. The most famous anecdote from the Agoge involves a boy who stole a fox and hid it beneath his cloak. When confronted, he denied having the fox and continued to deny it even as the fox, hidden and panicking, tore into his stomach with its claws. The boy died rather than admit what he had done. Whether this specific story is literally true matters less than what it illustrates about Spartan values. The Agoge did not teach that stealing was wrong. It taught that getting caught was the failure. Concealment, endurance, the ability to maintain composure under pain, these were the real lessons. Honesty to authority was not a Spartan virtue. Resilience under pressure was everything. Fact 10. Spartan boys were deliberately kept hungry. The food shortage in the Agoge was intentional policy. Boys received just enough to survive, not enough to be satisfied. Ancient sources describe this as training them to endure hunger during campaigns, when supply lines might fail and armies might go days without eating. But the hunger served another purpose too. It made the boys resourceful. They foraged, they stole, they learned to identify edible plants and to move quietly at night when the risk of being caught was lower. The Spartan state was, in a sense, engineering a population of men who would never be broken by physical deprivation because they had never known anything else. By the time a Spartan soldier went to war, he had already spent most of his life in controlled discomfort. Fact 11. Spartan women could own property. In most of the ancient Greek world, women had almost no legal rights. They could not own property, could not conduct significant financial transactions, and had almost no public life. Sparta was a profound exception. Spartan women could own land. They could inherit property. They could conduct business. By some ancient accounts, Spartan women controlled a substantial portion of the land in Laconia. Aristotle, who was no friend to Sparta, complained that this had weakened the state by allowing too much wealth to concentrate in female hands. The reason for this unusual situation was practical. Spartan men spent their entire lives in military service, away from home, training, or at war. Someone had to manage the estates. Spartan women became, by necessity, economically powerful in ways their counterparts elsewhere never were. Fact 12. Spartan girls were trained athletically. The physical training that defined Spartan boys extended, in modified form, to Spartan girls. Girls ran, wrestled, threw the javelin and the discus. They competed in athletic events. They were fed well and encouraged to be physically strong. The reasoning was explicitly eugenic: strong mothers produced stronger children. Spartan girls were not being trained to fight, though some ancient sources suggest that in extreme circumstances, Spartan women did take up arms to defend their city. They were being trained to be healthy, capable, and physically vigorous so that the next generation of Spartan warriors would begin life with the strongest possible biological foundation. The result was women who were, by ancient accounts, startlingly different from women anywhere else in Greece. Fact 13. The famous "come back with your shield or on it" was almost certainly invented later. One of the most quoted lines attributed to Spartan mothers, "come back with your shield or on it," is almost certainly not authentic. The phrase implies that a Spartan mother would rather see her son dead than defeated. It appears in ancient sources, but its origins are murky, and it has the quality of a legend that became more polished with each retelling. What is more likely true is that Spartan women were trained, culturally and psychologically, not to show public grief at the deaths of sons and husbands. To weep visibly was considered shameful. Mothers and wives were expected to receive news of battlefield death with composure. Whether that composure was genuine or performed, whether it was pride or something closer to suppressed devastation, no ancient source can tell us. Fact 14. Sparta had two kings simultaneously. Sparta's political structure was unlike anything else in the ancient world. It was governed simultaneously by two kings, drawn from two separate royal families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. These two dynasties had coexisted for centuries, sharing royal power in a way that prevented either family from becoming too dominant. The kings served primarily as military commanders and religious figures. They led armies into battle and performed certain sacred rites that only they could perform. But they did not rule alone, they were checked by the ephors, 5 magistrates elected annually by Spartan citizens, and by the Gerousia, a council of elders. The result was a system of distributed power that was, in its own way, more balanced than many ancient governments. Even kings could be, and were, put on trial. Fact 15. Spartan kings were subject to trial and exile. The kings of Sparta held significant power, but they were not beyond accountability. Both kings could be fined, exiled, or even executed if the Spartan state judged them to have acted improperly. Several famous Spartan kings were tried and punished. Pausanias, the general who led the Greeks to victory at Plataea in 479 BC, one of the most important battles in Greek history, was later tried for treason, fled to a temple for sanctuary, and died there of starvation when Sparta decided to wall up the entrance and wait. Leonidas, of Thermopylae fame, was never tried, but his half-brother, who succeeded him, was eventually exiled. In Sparta, no one was entirely beyond the reach of the state. Not even its kings. Fact 16. The Spartan army marched into battle to music. The Spartan phalanx, the famous wall of shields and spears, advanced into battle not in silence, not with battle cries, but to the sound of flutes. Specifically, the aulos, a double-piped wind instrument with a reedy, penetrating sound. The flutes were played to control the pace of the advance. A phalanx that ran into battle became disordered, soldiers lost their footing, lines broke, the shield wall fell apart. The flutes kept the pace measured and even, allowing the formation to advance as a single unit. Ancient sources describe this as one of the more unsettling aspects of fighting against the Spartans. Most armies screamed and charged. The Spartans walked, in step, to music, as though what was coming was not a battle but a ceremony. Fact 17. Spartan soldiers were expected to wear their hair long. The image of a Spartan warrior, bronze helmet, red cloak, long spear, is usually imagined with the face obscured. But Spartan soldiers wore their hair very long, and before battle, they would comb it. This was not vanity in the way we might understand it. Long hair in the Spartan tradition was a mark of a free man. Helots and other non-citizens were expected to keep their hair short. Long hair also made a warrior look larger and more imposing in battle. It flowed from beneath a helmet and gave the impression of something almost animal. Plutarch records that a Spartan king once said that long hair made a handsome man more beautiful and an ugly man more terrible. Before Thermopylae, the Persians sent a scout ahead and reported back that the Spartans were sitting outside their camp, combing their hair. Fact 18. The red cloak was practical, not just ceremonial. The Spartan scarlet cloak, the chiton or himation in its military version, was associated so strongly with Spartan identity that it became a symbol of the warrior culture itself. But the red color served a practical purpose beyond aesthetics. In battle, wounds bleed. A soldier who sought his own blood, or the blood of his comrades, might falter, might feel fear where discipline was meant to hold. The red color of the Spartan cloak was chosen, according to ancient tradition, because it made blood less visible. A soldier wounded in a red garment would not see the stain spreading across his clothing. Whether this is the actual origin or a rationalization created later is uncertain. But it illustrates how Spartan military culture wove practical calculation into everything, even the color of its clothing. Fact 19. Spartan men lived in barracks until age 30. A Spartan man did not go home when the agoge ended. Even after completing his training, a Spartan citizen was required to live in communal barracks and eat in a communal mess, called a sycition or phoeditia, until the age of 30. This applied even to married men. A Spartan could marry earlier than 30, but he could not live with his wife. He would have to visit her in secret, at night, then return to the barracks before dawn. Ancient sources describe young Spartan couples meeting in the dark, the husband slipping away before light. This arrangement was justified on military grounds. Soldiers who lived together, ate together, and trained together would fight better together. But it also ensured that the state, not the family, remained the primary institution in a Spartan man's life. Fact 20. The Spartan mess hall was a political institution. The Sicilian, the communal mess, was not merely a place to eat. It was the basic unit of Spartan political life. Every full Spartan citizen was required to belong to one, and membership was not automatic. Existing members had to vote unanimously to admit a new member. A single negative vote was enough to exclude someone. An exclusion from the Sicilian meant exclusion from full citizenship. A man could be disqualified from his mess if he could not contribute his required monthly portion of food, wine, and other provisions. This created a strange situation. A man could be born into a Spartan family, complete the agoge, serve in the army, and still lose his citizenship because he could not afford his mess dues. Poverty, in Sparta, had political consequences as severe as cowardice. Fact 21. Sparta had a declining citizen population that it could never solve. One of the central paradoxes of Sparta was that its system, designed to produce perfect warriors, was slowly killing itself. The citizen population, the Spartiates who had full rights, declined steadily throughout Sparta's history. At the time of Thermopylae, Sparta may have had around 8,000 full citizens. By the time of its final defeat at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, some estimates suggest fewer than 1,000. The reasons were multiple. The agoge rigors killed some before they could produce children. The constant warfare killed others. The requirement for mess dues pushed men into poverty and out of citizenship. And Sparta, unlike other Greek cities, did not readily extend citizenship to outsiders. It was a closed system that was, in the most literal sense, consuming itself. Fact 22. Thermopylae was not just 300 Spartans. The legend of Thermopylae has 300 Spartans holding a narrow pass against the entire Persian army, and it is one of the most powerful military stories in Western history. But the 300 Spartiates were not alone. At Thermopylae, the Greek force included around 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and several hundred other Greeks from various city-states. When the Persian flanking movement was discovered and the Greek allies were dismissed, the Thespians, men from Thespi, chose to stay and die alongside the Spartans. The 300 Spartans have been remembered for 2.5 millennia. The 700 Thespians, who also died to the last man, are almost entirely forgotten. History chose its symbol. The symbol was accurate but incomplete. Fact 23. Leonidas chose the 300 himself. The 300 Spartans who went to Thermopylae were not simply the best available soldiers, assigned by lottery or rank. Leonidas chose them personally. And his criteria, according to ancient sources, was specific. He chose men who had living sons. The reasoning was practical and cold. Sparta could not replace experienced warriors quickly. The agoge took decades. If these men were going to die, as Leonidas apparently believed they would, it was important that they had already fulfilled their primary biological obligation to the state by producing heirs. He did not choose the strongest. He chose men who had already secured Sparta's next generation. The selection reveals how Sparta thought about its warriors. Not as individuals, but as components in a larger system that would continue whether they survived or not. Fact 24. The oracle at Delphi predicted Sparta's dilemma before Thermopylae. Before the Persian invasion, Sparta consulted the oracle at Delphi, as it did before all major undertakings. The oracle's response was, as usual, phrased ambiguously, but its meaning was clear enough: either Sparta would be destroyed, or one of its kings would die. This prophecy shaped how the Spartans approached what came next. Leonidas, according to various ancient accounts, understood that he was going to die at Thermopylae. Some sources suggest he saw his death there as the fulfillment of the oracle, that by dying himself, he was saving Sparta from total destruction. Whether this is historical fact or later mythologizing is impossible to know with certainty. But it adds a layer to the famous last stand, not reckless courage, perhaps, but a calculated sacrifice made in full knowledge of what was coming. Fact 25. Sparta's victory at Thermopylae was also a military failure. Thermopylae is remembered as a heroic last stand, and it was. But it was also a military defeat. The Persian army passed through. Greece was invaded. Athens was sacked and burned. The Acropolis was destroyed. The strategic purpose of holding the pass was to buy time for the Greek fleet to engage the Persians at sea, and in that sense, the delay may have contributed to the Greek naval victory at Salamis. But the pass fell. The Persians continued south. If Thermopylae is a victory, it is a victory of spirit and symbolism, not of military outcome. The Greeks who died there delayed an invasion by perhaps 2 or 3 days. What turned the Persian War was not the pass, but the sea, and the Athenian admiral Themistocles, not Leonidas, is the man most responsible for Greece surviving 480 BCE. Fact 26. Sparta and Athens were nearly identical in population at their peak. The contrast between Athens and Sparta, democratic versus oligarchic, intellectual versus military, open versus closed, has defined how we think about ancient Greece. But the two cities were roughly similar in total population, including slaves and non-citizens, at their respective peaks. What differed enormously was the proportion of full citizens. Athens extended citizenship relatively broadly and had a large citizen body. Sparta's full citizens, the Spartiates, were always a small minority of the total population living in Laconia. The Helots, the Perioikoi, free non-citizens who paid taxes and served in the military, and other groups made up the vast majority. Sparta was not a city where most people were warriors. It was a city where a small warrior elite was supported by a much larger unfree or semi-free population. Fact 27. Spartan discipline extended to how they were allowed to speak. The word laconic, meaning brief, terse, using as few words as possible, comes from Laconia, the region Sparta dominated. Spartans were expected to speak with extreme brevity, particularly in public and particularly in matters of war. Lengthy speeches were considered a sign of weakness or poor discipline. Several of the most famous Spartan sayings survive precisely because they were so short and so pointed. When Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, sent a message to Sparta threatening that if he entered Laconia he would destroy everything, the Spartan reply was a single word: if. Philip did not invade. Whether the story is precisely true, Spartan verbal economy was real and documented across multiple ancient sources. They had elevated silence and brevity into a form of power. Fact 28. Sparta had a complex relationship with its own mythology. The Spartans traced their origins to Heracles, Hercules, and considered themselves his descendants through his son Hylas. This lineage was not casual mythology. It was the foundation of Spartan royal legitimacy. Both royal families claimed descent from Heracles. This gave the kings a divine mandate that no mortal could challenge directly. It also gave Sparta a religious justification for its military dominance. The descendants of the greatest of Greek heroes were, by birthright, the greatest of Greek warriors. The mythology was carefully maintained and periodically reinforced through ritual. Sparta was not a city that separated its political identity from its religious identity. They were the same thing. The gods, and particularly Heracles and Apollo, were embedded in Spartan governance in ways that went beyond simple worship. Fact 29. The Spartans refused to fight at Marathon. In 490 BC, when the Persians landed at Marathon in Athens faced them with only Plataean support, the Athenians sent a famous runner, Phidippides, to Sparta to ask for help. The Spartans expressed sympathy and said they would come. Then they explained that they could not march until the full moon had passed, because religious law forbade them from going to war during certain sacred periods. The Athenians fought Marathon without them. They won. The Spartans arrived shortly after the battle was over, walked to the battlefield, looked at the Persian dead, and went home. Whether the religious prohibition was genuine or a convenient excuse will never be known. What is certain is that Athens faced and defeated the first Persian invasion without Spartan help, a fact that shaped the rivalry between the two cities for the next generation. Fact 30. Spartan pederasty was institutionalized and state-sanctioned. The relationships between older and younger males in the agoge were not incidental to the system, they were built into it. An older youth, called an iron, was expected to take a younger boy as a companion and protege. This relationship had educational dimensions. The older boy was responsible for the younger one's training and conduct. Ancient sources differ on whether these relationships were physical, and the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. What is clear is that the emotional bonds formed in the agoge were considered by Sparta to be militarily useful. Men who cared deeply for each other would fight harder to protect each other. The Sacred Band of Thebes, the elite unit that eventually broke Spartan military dominance, was explicitly organized on this principle. Sparta built it into its system earlier and less formally. Fact 31. Spartan women were known for speaking their minds. Ancient sources are full of sharp, pointed remarks attributed to Spartan women, a genre so distinctive it has its own name, the sayings of Spartan women, preserved partly by Plutarch. The content of these sayings is consistently direct, often harsh, and occasionally startling. Spartan women told their sons not to return if they had disgraced themselves. They reportedly mocked men who showed fear. One woman, told her son had been killed in battle, asked only whether he had died well. This directness was noted, and often criticized, by ancient writers from other parts of Greece, who found Spartan women unsettling in their confidence. In Athens, a respectable woman was barely seen in public. In Sparta, women managed households, expressed opinions, and were expected to be as psychologically formidable as their husbands. Fact 32. Sparta practiced a form of shared reproduction. Spartan eugenics extended beyond the examination of newborns. Ancient sources, again, primarily Plutarch, describe a practice in which older Spartan men might encourage younger, physically impressive men to sleep with their wives, with the goal of producing stronger children. This was not infidelity in the Greek sense, it was closer to a state-endorsed arrangement aimed at improving the biological quality of the next generation. Similarly, a Spartan man might in theory borrow a neighbor's wife for the same purpose, with the husband's consent. How widespread or systematic this was is genuinely uncertain. But the fact that ancient sources describe it as an accepted Spartan practice and distinguish it explicitly from infidelity or immorality reveals how thoroughly Sparta had subordinated personal and family life to the collective goal of producing better soldiers. Fact 33. The ephors could overrule the kings. Sparta's 5 ephors, elected annually from the citizen body, held extraordinary power. They could summon kings to appear before them. They could fine or arrest kings. They could declare war. Each month, the ephors and the kings exchanged oaths. The king swore to rule according to the laws, the ephors swore to uphold the kingship as long as it did so. This mutual oath was a genuine balance of power, not a formality. The ephors could, and did, act against kings who overstepped. When Pausanias, the victor of Plataea, became dangerously ambitious, corresponding with the Persian king, claiming privileges no Spartan was meant to claim. The ephors moved against him. The institution of the ephorate was one of the most genuinely innovative political arrangements in the ancient world, a check on power that answered to the citizen body, not to hereditary authority. Fact 34. Sparta's currency was deliberately made useless elsewhere. Sparta used iron bars as currency, heavy, cumbersome, and made of a metal so common it had little value outside of Laconia. According to ancient sources, this was deliberate policy attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. By making Spartan currency worthless outside Sparta, the system discouraged trade with other cities, prevented the accumulation of wealth, and made it very difficult for Spartans to be bribed by foreign powers. Gold and silver, the universal currencies of the ancient Mediterranean, were officially banned from private possession in Sparta. Whether this ban was consistently enforced is doubtful. By the later period of Spartan history, gold and silver clearly existed among the elite. But the original intention was to create an economy that served the military state and nothing else. Fact 35. Lycurgus may never have existed. Almost everything distinctive about Sparta, the agoge, the communal messes, the iron currency, the dual kingship, the ephorate, was attributed to a single lawgiver named Lycurgus, who supposedly lived centuries before the classical period. The problem is that Lycurgus may not have been a real historical person. Ancient sources disagree wildly about when he lived, whether he was human or divine, and whether he created the Spartan system all at once or whether it evolved gradually over generations. Thucydides, the most rigorous of ancient historians, is cautious about Lycurgus. Plutarch, who wrote a full biography of him, acknowledges that there is absolutely nothing that can be stated without question. Sparta's origin myth may have required a founding genius, and if that genius did not exist, one was invented. Fact 36. Sparta produced excellent pottery before its military system solidified. The Sparta most people know, silent, austere, militaristic, was not always what Sparta was. In the Archaic period, before approximately 550 BC, Sparta was a culturally vibrant city. Spartan pottery from this era is distinctive, colorful, and sophisticated. Spartan bronzework was traded across the Mediterranean. Sparta hosted poets and musicians. The famous poet Alcman worked in Sparta and wrote choral poetry that was performed at Spartan religious festivals. Something happened in the 6th century BC. Scholars debate exactly what that caused Sparta to turn inward, close itself off, and develop the extreme military orientation we associate with it. The austere Sparta of Thermopylae was not ancient. It was, in historical terms, relatively recent. Fact 37. Spartan men were not allowed to choose their wives freely. Marriage in Sparta was not a private arrangement. The state had a strong interest in who married whom and when. Spartan men who remained unmarried past a certain age or who married women considered unsuitable faced social and legal penalties. Bachelors could be publicly humiliated, made to march naked in winter, excluded from certain religious ceremonies, denied the respect normally owed to older citizens. Even elderly Spartan men who had never married were not given the deference normally owed to age. The reasoning was straightforward: the state needed children, particularly sons who would enter the agoge. A Spartan man who chose not to marry, or delayed marriage, was failing in his most fundamental obligation to the collective. The choice that other Greeks considered deeply personal was, in Sparta, a matter of public concern. Fact 38. Spartan weddings involved a ritual abduction. Spartan wedding ceremonies were unlike those anywhere else in Greece. The bride's head was shaved. She was dressed in men's clothing and sandals. She was then left alone in a darkened room. Her new husband, still living in the barracks, would come to her in secret at night, spend time with her in the dark, and leave before dawn. This continued for months or even years before the husband actually moved in with her, which could not happen until he was 30. The ritual elements, the shaved head, the male clothing, the darkness, the secrecy have been interpreted in various ways. Some scholars see it as an easing of the transition for young men who had spent their entire lives in exclusively male environments. Others see it as another expression of Spartan belief that difficulty and discomfort were embedded in every significant experience. Fact 39. The Battle of Leuctra destroyed the Spartan army in a single afternoon. For 2 centuries after Thermopylae, the Spartan phalanx was considered essentially unbeatable on land. Other Greek armies had learned to avoid direct confrontation with it. Then in 371 BC, at the Battle of Leuctra, the Theban general Epaminondas destroyed the Spartan army in a single engagement. He did it by concentrating his strongest troops on one flank opposite the Spartan right, where their best soldiers traditionally fought, and hitting that flank with overwhelming force. The Spartan line broke. Around 400 Spartiates died, out of a total citizen population that may have been fewer than 1,000. Sparta never fully recovered. Leuctra was not just a military defeat. It was the moment when the myth of Spartan invincibility died, and with it, much of the psychological infrastructure that kept the Helots in subjection. Fact 40. Sparta was never sacked in the classical period. For all its eventual decline, Sparta's physical city was never captured or sacked during the classical era. Athens was burned by the Persians. Thebes was later razed by Alexander. Corinth was destroyed by Rome. Sparta, city of no walls, was never taken by an enemy army while it retained meaningful power. After Leuctra, Theban armies marched into the Peloponnese and came close. They camped outside Sparta and the city prepared to defend itself. But they did not storm the city. Whether this was because the effort seemed not worth the cost, or because Epaminondas had other strategic goals, the city survived. Sparta's end was not dramatic. It was slow, a long diminishment, a fading from power into irrelevance, over generations. Cities that burn at least get an ending. Sparta's was quieter than that. Fact 41. Helot rebellions were a constant fear. The thing Sparta feared most was not Persia. It was not Athens. It was the Helots. The subject population that outnumbered Spartan citizens by such a vast margin represented an existential threat that never went away. After a massive earthquake struck Sparta in 464 BC, the Helots of Messenia rose in a great revolt. The Spartans needed years and outside help to suppress it. The earthquake and the revolt it triggered may be the single event that most decisively shifted the course of Spartan history. It weakened the city militarily at a critical moment, damaged infrastructure, and forced Sparta to call on Athens for assistance. Athens sent troops. But political tensions led Sparta to dismiss the Athenian force before the revolt was over, an insult that contributed to the hostility that eventually became the Peloponnesian War. Fact 42. The Peloponnesian War was, in part, a war about slavery. The great conflict between Athens and Sparta that consumed the Greek world from 431 to 404 BC had many causes: trade competition, alliance obligations, strategic anxiety. But one underappreciated dimension was the Helot question. Athens, as its power grew, had become a haven for escaped slaves and a city that, at least in theory, offered greater freedom to more people. Spartan fear of Athenian influence over the Helots was genuine and documented. During the war, Athens established a base at Pylos, on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese, directly in the heartland of Messenia, Helot country. Athenian ships and soldiers encouraged Helot defections. Sparta's desperate need to dislodge the Athenians from Pylos, so desperate it even accepted the surrender of surrounded Spartan soldiers, an almost unprecedented event, was driven in large part by fear of what Athens was doing to its slave population. Fact 43. Sparta accepted a Persian subsidy to defeat Athens. The final years of the Peloponnesian War were funded, in significant part, by Persian gold. Sparta, which could not match Athenian naval power without help, made a deal with the Persian Empire, the same empire it had helped repel 50 years earlier at Thermopylae. Persia provided silver to build and maintain Spartan warships. In exchange, Sparta agreed to recognize Persian sovereignty over Greek cities in Asia Minor, effectively handing back to Persia territory that Greeks had fought and died to free. This transaction was managed through Persian satraps, particularly Lysander, the Spartan admiral who eventually defeated Athens, had a close relationship with the Persian prince Cyrus. Sparta won the Peloponnesian War with Persian money. The victors of Thermopylae had, within a generation, become Persian clients. Fact 44. After defeating Athens, Sparta became the tyrant it had claimed to fight. Sparta framed the Peloponnesian War, in part, as a war of liberation, freeing Greek cities from Athenian imperial control. The Athenian Empire had been exploitative, extracting tribute, interfering in local governance, and occasionally resorting to brutal suppression of dissent. When Sparta won, it installed its own system of control. Spartan governors, harmasts, were placed in cities across Greece. Oligarchic governments friendly to Sparta replaced democracies. The most notorious case was Athens itself, where Sparta imposed the 30 tyrants and oligarchic junta that conducted a reign of terror against Athenian citizens for about a year before being overthrown. Sparta had not freed Greece. It had replaced one kind of domination with another, and had done so more brutally in some cases than Athens ever had. Fact 45. Sparta struggled with its own success after the Peloponnesian War. Winning the Peloponnesian War created problems Sparta had never anticipated. Suddenly Sparta was the dominant power in the Greek world, responsible for managing far-flung territories and complex diplomatic relationships. But Sparta's institutions were designed for a world where it was one power among several, they were not designed for empire. The agoge produced soldiers, not administrators. The communal messes produced fighters, not diplomats. Spartan commanders sent abroad with power often became corrupt, famously so in the case of Lysander, who accumulated personal wealth and influence at a rate that alarmed even his fellow Spartans. The more Sparta dominated, the more its own internal contradictions became visible. Victory had given it responsibilities it had no framework to fulfill. Fact 46. Spartan boys were flogged ritually at the altar of Artemis. One of the most striking and well-documented Spartan rituals involved the ritual flogging of boys at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys endured whipping while attempting to steal cheeses from the altar, with the goal of taking as many as possible while being struck. The contest was about endurance, who could take the most pain without crying out, without collapsing. Ancient sources describe boys dying during this ritual. Later in Sparta's history, during the Roman period, when Sparta had become a tourist attraction, the ritual was reportedly made more extreme to satisfy spectators who came from across the empire to watch. Bleachers were built around the altar. What had once been a grim test of endurance had become, in its final form, entertainment for foreign visitors. The same ritual. A completely different meaning. Fact 47. The Spartan system produced surprisingly few great generals. Given Sparta's reputation as the supreme military culture of the ancient world, it produced a surprisingly small number of commanders recognized as genuinely brilliant strategists. Leonidas is famous for his last stand, not for strategic innovation. Lysander, who won the Peloponnesian War, was effective but depended heavily on Persian resources. Brasidas, who conducted a brilliant campaign in northern Greece during the Peloponnesian War, was exceptional, and notably, he was exceptional in part because he did things Spartan military doctrine normally did not do, like besieging cities and conducting diplomatic negotiations. The Spartan system was very good at producing brave, disciplined, physically capable soldiers. It was less good at producing the kind of flexible, creative, strategically imaginative generals that Alexander of Macedon or Hannibal of Carthage would later represent. Fact 48. Sparta had a celebrated festival of naked dancing. The Gymnopedia, literally, the Festival of Naked Boys, was one of Sparta's most important annual religious festivals. It involved choral competitions in which naked young men danced and sang in the summer heat of the Spartan agora. The dances were athletic and performed in the full heat of a Laconian summer, without shade. The festival lasted several days and was considered extremely important. Spartan armies were sometimes delayed or recalled because of its schedule. The Gymnopedia was watched by the entire citizen body. It was simultaneously a religious event, an athletic display, and a demonstration of the training system's results. The naked body, in Sparta, was not shameful, it was proof. Proof that the system worked, that the agoge had produced what it was meant to produce. Fact 49. Sparta's geography shaped its character as much as its laws. Laconia, the valley dominated by Sparta, is enclosed by mountains on most sides. To the east and west, the Taygetus and Parnan ranges rise sharply. To the north, the valley narrows. The landscape itself created a sense of enclosure, of separateness from the wider Greek world. Sparta did not have easy access to the sea in the way Athens did. It was an inland power, agriculturally rich in its valley, but geographically isolated. This isolation helped maintain Sparta's unusual social system. It was harder for outside ideas, outside wealth, and outside people to flow freely into a city ringed by mountains. When Sparta did engage with the wider world, it was almost always on its own terms, on its own schedule, with specific military or political objectives. The mountains were not just a defense. They were a filter. Fact 50. The Perioikoi were free but not citizens. Between the Spartiates at the top and the Helots at the bottom existed a middle group, the Perioikoi, meaning those who live around. These were free Greeks who lived in towns throughout Laconia and Messenia. They paid taxes, served in the Spartan military, and were subject to Spartan authority. In return, they were allowed to live freely, conduct trade, and practice crafts, all activities that full Spartan citizens were forbidden from doing. The Perioikoi were the people who actually made things in Laconia. They were the potters, the metal workers, the traders. The bronze armor that Spartan warriors wore was almost certainly made by Perioikoi craftsmen. The system was, in its way, an elegant division of labor. The citizens fought, the Perioikoi worked, and the Helots farmed. Each group had its defined role, its defined boundary, and almost no way to cross it. Fact 51. Sparta executed its own general after Plataea. The Battle of Plataea in 479 BC was the decisive land battle of the Persian Wars, the victory that, combined with Salamis, drove the Persians out of Greece. The Spartan general Pausanias commanded the Greek forces and won a famous victory. He then proceeded to behave in ways that alarmed everyone. He began adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian clothing, hosting Persian-style banquets, corresponding with the Persian king Xerxes, and apparently offering to betray Greece in exchange for power and a royal marriage. The Spartans, eventually, moved against him. He took refuge in the Temple of Athena of the Bronze House in Sparta, a sanctuary no one could violate without religious pollution. The Spartans walled up the entrance. They removed his mother, who had been first to bring a stone to seal the entrance. Pausanias starved to death inside. The man who saved Greece chose a strange ending. Fact 52. Sparta's decline was predicted by its own system. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC as Sparta's power was fading, analyzed what had gone wrong with devastating precision. He noted that Sparta had trained its men entirely for war and had no idea what to do with them in peacetime. He noted that Spartan women, having been given unusual freedom by the demands of the system, had accumulated wealth and property in ways that undermined the equal discipline the system claimed to promote. He noted that the citizen body was too small and declining. He noted that the economic arrangements were broken. Aristotle was not sympathetic to Sparta, he found much about it irrational and self-defeating. But his critique was precise. The Spartan system had been designed to win wars. It had never been designed to survive peace. And peace, eventually, came. Fact 53. Sparta freed helots who fought bravely, then sometimes killed them anyway. In desperate moments, Sparta offered helots something almost unthinkable: freedom, in exchange for military service. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta recruited helots as soldiers, called neodemotius, or new citizens, with the promise of manumission. Several thousand apparently served. After the war, some were freed, as promised. But ancient sources describe at least one troubling episode. Sparta announced that any helots who believed they had served the state with particular distinction should come forward to be recognized and rewarded. Around 2,000 did. They were never seen again. What happened to them is not known with certainty. The ancient source, Thucydides, simply records that they disappeared. The implication was that Sparta, fearing a group of emboldened, experienced, freed helots, eliminated them quietly. Whether this is precisely true, the story has the cold logic of the Cryptia. Fact 54. The Spartan system inspired some of history's most dangerous admirers. Sparta's influence on subsequent political thought has been both vast and troubling. The idea of a society organized entirely around military virtue, where the individual is subordinate to the collective, where weakness is eliminated and strength is worshipped, has attracted admiration from people who should perhaps have thought more carefully. The founders of the French Revolution admired Sparta. So did Robespierre, specifically. In the 19th and 20th centuries, nationalist and authoritarian movements across Europe found in Sparta a precedent for systems that eliminated the weak and celebrated the martial. The actual Sparta complex, often contradictory, built on a foundation of terror and unfree labor, was not what these admirers thought they were admiring. But the myth of Sparta proved resilient enough to survive contact with history. Fact 55. Spartan kings were buried with unusual honors. When a Spartan king died, the mourning was unlike anything elsewhere in Greece. All Spartans' citizens, helots, perioikoi, were required to attend the funeral and to demonstrate grief. Women beat copper vessels as a sign of mourning. At least 10 men and 10 women from each household were required to participate in the funeral rites. The body of the king was buried inside the city, which was unusual, as most Greeks buried their dead outside city walls. After the burial, there was a period of 10 days during which all public business was suspended and the Spartans mourned communally. The king was then awarded divine honors, worshipped as a hero after death. The treatment of dead kings was one of the few moments when Sparta's emotional life became publicly visible. The iron restraint that governed everything else briefly, formally, dissolved. Fact 56. Sparta had rules about how to mourn. Sparta's system of grief was as regulated as everything else. There were rules about who could mourn publicly, for how long, and in what manner. Excessive grief, prolonged weeping, dramatic displays of mourning was considered inappropriate, even shameful. The death of a soldier in battle was supposed to be received with composure. But composure was not emotional coldness. Ancient evidence suggests that Spartans felt their losses as deeply as anyone. But the system required that feeling be controlled, contained, expressed only in prescribed ways and for prescribed durations. The regulation of grief was, in a sense, the regulation of the one experience that most reliably breaks human psychological defenses. That Sparta attempted to regulate even this reveals something about the totality of the system's ambition. Fact 57. Sparta's famous simplicity was partly performance. The austerity of Spartan life, the plain food, the rough clothing, the absence of luxury, was real in many respects, particularly within the agoge and the communal messes. But Sparta was not entirely without wealth or beauty. Spartan temples were decorated. Spartan religious festivals involved music, dance, and elaborate ceremony. Spartan kings lived better than ordinary citizens. The Spartan elite, particularly in later periods, accumulated gold and silver despite official prohibitions. The simplicity that Sparta projected to the world was, in part, a carefully maintained image, the same way the absence of walls was an image. Both said, "We do not need what weaker peoples need." The projection of austerity was itself a form of power. Appearing to need nothing made Sparta seem invulnerable. Whether the appearance matched the reality was another matter. Fact 58. Sparta maintained the pretense of the Lycurgan system long after it had broken down. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, the Spartan system was badly deteriorated. The citizen body was tiny. Wealth inequality had grown dramatically, concentrated in fewer hands. The communal messes still existed in name, but their equalizing function had collapsed. The agoge continued, but it was training fewer and fewer men. Kings and generals were openly acquiring personal wealth. And yet Sparta maintained the fiction of Lycurgan purity, continued to describe itself as the living embodiment of ancient virtue, continued to lecture other Greeks about discipline and simplicity. The gap between Sparta's self-description and its reality became, in the later classical period, one of the more quietly devastating features of its decline. It was a city that had forgotten how to be what it claimed to be, but could not stop claiming it. Fact 59. A later Spartan king tried to restore the old system and was killed for it. In the 3rd century BC, a young Spartan king named Agis IV looked at what Sparta had become: the inequality, the shrunken citizen body, the corruption of the agoge, and decided to restore the Lycurgan system in its original form. He proposed canceling debts, redistributing land, and expanding citizenship. The wealthy elite of Sparta, who had the most to lose, arranged his execution. He was killed without trial, strangled in a dungeon. His mother and grandmother, who had supported his reforms, were killed immediately after. A few years later, another king named Cleomenes III tried again, more violently and more successfully, pushing through land redistribution by force. He had some success, expanded the army, and briefly restored Spartan military relevance, before being defeated by a coalition of enemies and dying in exile in Egypt. Sparta's last attempt to be itself ended in a foreign country. Fact 60. Roman tourists came to watch Spartan rituals. After Rome absorbed Greece, Sparta occupied a peculiar position in the Roman imagination as a living museum of ancient virtue. Romans, who deeply admired the Spartan ideal even as the real Sparta had long since become a provincial shadow of itself, came to watch Spartan rituals that were performed specifically for their benefit. The flogging ritual at the altar of Artemis Orthia, which had once been a serious test of endurance, became a spectator event. Bleachers were constructed. Young Spartans were flogged while tourists watched. Some boys apparently died during these performances. The Romans found in Sparta a reflection of their own ideals about discipline, sacrifice, and martial virtue. The Spartans, for their part, monetized the display. It was a strange end for a culture that had once declared its warriors its walls. Fact 61. The word Spartan survives because Sparta did not write. One of history's great ironies is that Sparta, which left almost no written records, has left one of the most durable cultural legacies of any ancient civilization. Laconic, Spartan, agoge words from Sparta's world are still in daily use. The endurance of Sparta's reputation is partly because it did not write things down. What Sparta left was a silence that others could fill with their own projections. Athens wrote philosophy and plays and histories, and those texts could be read and critiqued and found wanting. Sparta left an image, the shield, the red cloak, the 300, and an image can be made to mean almost anything. The less Sparta wrote, the more powerful its mythology became. The city of silences became paradoxically, one of the most talked about cities in history. Fact 62. Sparta's army at its peak was smaller than most people imagine. The Spartan army at the height of its reputation, the force that terrified other Greeks and intimidated the Persians, was not a vast horde. At Plataea, the Spartan force numbered around 10,000, including perioikoi. The full Spartiate contingent, the men who had completed the agoge and were full citizens, was probably around 5,000. By the time of Leuctra, as discussed, the Spartiates in the field may have numbered only around 1,000. The terror the Spartan army inspired was entirely disproportionate to its size. It was sustained by reputation, by the memory of decades of victories, and by the psychological reality that fighting Spartans meant fighting men who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this moment. The army was small. The fear it generated was enormous. The gap between those two facts is where the Spartan legend lived. Fact 63. Sparta's relationship with the oracle at Delphi was essential to its legitimacy. Almost every major Spartan decision, going to war, changing the law, interpreting a crisis, involved consulting the oracle at Delphi. This was not unique to Sparta, many Greek states used Delphi. But Sparta was unusual in the degree to which oracular responses were woven into its constitutional structure. There was an official body of men whose specific job was to travel to Delphi, receive oracular responses, and bring them back. These men, the Pythioi, were appointed by the kings and were among the most trusted officials in the state. The oracle's responses were stored and could be consulted later. Sparta was, in a sense, governed by a dual authority, the laws of Lycurgus and the ongoing guidance of Apollo through his priestess at Delphi. When Sparta's kings needed to justify an action that the laws might not support, a favorable oracle could provide the necessary authority. Fact 64. Sparta's decline freed the Helots after centuries of subjugation. After Leuctra, when Theban power replaced Spartan dominance in the Peloponnese, the Theban general Epaminondas did something that Sparta's enemies had never previously managed: he freed the Messenian Helots. He refounded the ancient city of Messene, with massive walls, some of which still stand today, and established a Messenian state. After generations of subjugation, possibly centuries, the Helots of Messenia became citizens of a new city. The psychological impact on Sparta was profound. Messenia, whose agricultural output had fed Sparta and whose people had served as Sparta's labor foundation, was now a free city on Sparta's border and a permanent reminder of what Sparta had built its entire civilization upon. Sparta never recovered Messenia. It remained a wound for the rest of Sparta's existence. Fact 65. The Spartan economy was always more fragile than its military. Sparta's military reputation was built on a foundation that the military itself could not sustain indefinitely: the agricultural output of Laconia and Messenia, worked by Helots, supporting a citizen body that did nothing but train and fight. As long as the Helots were controlled, the citizen body was large enough, and Sparta avoided expensive foreign adventures, the system worked. When any one of these variables changed, and over time, all of them did, the system began to fail. Sparta could not maintain its army after Leuctra because it did not have the men. It did not have the men because the agoge and constant warfare had reduced the citizen body. It could not compensate by expanding citizenship because its entire social structure depended on the distinction between citizens and everyone else. The economy and the society had been designed as a single, closed system. Closed systems break. Fact 66. Brasidas was the exception that proved the Spartan rule. Brasidas, who led Spartan campaigns in northern Greece in the 420s BC, was described by Thucydides in terms that stand out sharply against most Spartan commanders. He was diplomatic where Spartans were usually blunt. He was flexible where Spartans were usually rigid. He conducted sieges, made treaties, won cities over by persuasion as much as by force. The cities of northern Greece that joined him, and many did willingly, were responding to something they had not expected from a Spartan general, a man who seemed to understand their interests. When Brasidas died in battle, those cities mourned him as a hero. Sparta honored him, but never quite produced another like him. His particular combination of military skill and diplomatic intelligence was not what the Agoge was designed to produce. He was an anomaly, and anomalies, in Spartan culture, were not cultivated. Fact 67. Sparta was technically still a functioning state under Roman rule. Sparta survived the Roman conquest of Greece, as it survived most things, by outlasting the change around it. Under Rome, Sparta was granted a degree of self-governance and allowed to maintain certain of its ancient customs as a living museum of Greek virtue. It held elections, maintained its institutions in modified form, and cultivated its identity as the last remnant of classical Spartan culture. Roman senators came to see it. Roman emperors corresponded with it. Sparta used its reputation, the one asset that had never entirely degraded, to maintain relevance in a world completely transformed from the one it had been built for. It was no longer powerful. It was no longer independent in any real sense. But it was still Sparta, which in the Roman world meant something. The myth kept the city alive long after the reality had faded. Fact 68. The site of ancient Sparta is still inhabited today. The modern Greek city of Sparta occupies roughly the same location as ancient Sparta. It is a small, quiet city in the Eurotas Valley, surrounded by orange and olive groves, with the Taygetus Mountains rising to the west. The ancient city left almost no monumental architecture. Its buildings were largely wood and mud brick, not stone, and they have long since disappeared. Archaeological excavations have found enough to confirm the location and some details of the layout. The sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, where the flogging rituals took place, has been identified and partially excavated. The theater is partially visible. There is no Spartan equivalent of the Athenian Acropolis. No Parthenon, no grand ruins to photograph. The physical legacy of Sparta is, appropriately, almost invisible. What it left behind was not in stone. Fact 69. Sparta produced at least one genuine philosopher. The stereotype of Sparta as an anti-intellectual culture, a place that valued muscle over mind, is largely accurate but not entirely so. Sparta produced at least one figure who belongs in the tradition of Greek philosophical thought, Chelon of Sparta, who lived in the 6th century BC and was considered one of the 7 sages of Greece, a list of ancient wise men whose sayings were treasured across the Greek world. Chelon was an Ephor, and several sayings attributed to him survive. One of the most famous, "Know yourself." Whether Chelon originated this or it was attributed to him after the fact, the point is that he was recognized across the Greek world, including by Athenians who were not inclined to compliment Spartans, as a man of genuine wisdom. Even the most militaristic culture in antiquity occasionally produced men who thought as deeply as they fought. Fact 70. The Spartan constitution was admired across the ancient world. Whatever its practical failures, Sparta's constitution, the combination of dual kings, ephors, Gerousia, and citizen assembly, was admired by ancient political thinkers for its balance. Aristotle analyzed it extensively in his Politics, identifying what he saw as a mixed constitution that combined elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy in a way that prevented any single faction from gaining total control. Polybius, the Greek historian writing in the 2nd century BC, compared it favorably to the Roman constitution and credited it with giving Sparta its long period of internal stability. The system was not democratic in the Athenian sense, and it had profound flaws. But as an attempt to distribute power and prevent tyranny, it was genuine and more stable over time than most ancient governments. Sparta did not fall to internal revolution the way Athens repeatedly did. Its stability was real, even if its justice was not. Fact 71. Spartan women had physical freedom that shocked other Greeks. Spartan women exercised outdoors, in public. They competed in athletic events that could be watched. They walked through the city without male escorts. They spoke in mixed company. For the rest of the Greek world, and particularly for Athenians, for whom respectable women were largely confined to the interior of the household, this was not merely unusual. It was scandalous. Ancient Athenian writers criticized Spartan women repeatedly. They were too free, too bold, too willing to express opinions. The famous beauty of Spartan women, which was noted widely in the ancient world, was attributed in part to their outdoor, physical lifestyle. But the criticism of their freedom was also rooted in something deeper. The implicit challenge their lives posed to the assumption that female confinement was natural. Sparta's women made the Athenian arrangement look like a choice, not a necessity. Fact 72. The Spartan army's shield was its most psychologically important weapon. The aspes, the large round shield carried by a Spartan hoplite, was not primarily a personal defense. In a phalanx formation, each man's shield protected the man to his left as much as himself. Dropping or abandoning a shield left the man beside you exposed. This is why the most profound act of cowardice in Sparta was not running from battle but throwing away one's shield. The shield was the collective, it represented the obligation each man had to the others standing beside him. Losing your spear was survivable. Losing your helmet was survivable. Losing your shield was not a personal failure. It was a betrayal. The Spartan word for coward, tresses, referred specifically to a man who had run. But the shield was what made running possible. To drop the shield was to declare yourself separate from the formation. In Sparta, there was nothing worse. Fact 73. Trizantes, men who had fled, were treated as dead. A Spartan who had run from battle, a Trizantes, a trembler, did not simply face shame. He faced a systematic social death. He was forbidden from holding public office. He was excluded from the communal messes. Other Spartans were not required to interact with him or to treat him with normal social courtesy. He could be struck in the street without legal consequence. He could not contract a marriage, or if already married, his wife was expected to leave him. His citizenship, though technically retained, was functionally meaningless. The depth of this punishment reflected how central the shared formation was to Spartan identity. A man who had broken the phalanx, who had put his own survival above the survival of those beside him, had broken the only covenant that Sparta recognized as fundamental. He remained alive. But in every sense that mattered in Sparta, he had ceased to exist. Fact 74. Spartan religion centered on Apollo and Artemis. Sparta's primary religious loyalties were to Apollo and Artemis, the divine twins, a dedication that shaped the rhythm of Spartan life in concrete ways. Apollo was associated with music, prophecy, and order. His oracle at Delphi guided Spartan decisions. Artemis Orthia was the goddess at whose shrine the flogging rituals took place. The major Spartan festivals, the Hyacinthiae, the Gymnopaedia, the Carnea, were religious occasions of genuine importance, not mere entertainment. The Carnea in particular was a festival during which warfare was religiously prohibited, which is why Sparta could not send its full army to Marathon in 490 BC. Religion in Sparta was not a private matter of personal belief. It was woven into the constitutional fabric of the state, governing when armies could march and when they could not, and providing the divine sanction that made the entire system feel inevitable rather than chosen. Fact 75. The final military glory of Sparta came from a mercenary. In the 3rd century BC, after Cleomenes III's failed reform movement and defeat, Sparta's military relevance had effectively ended. The last moment of genuine Spartan military significance came not from the state itself but from a mercenary commander named Nabis, who ruled Sparta as a tyrant, a title the old Sparta would have found incomprehensible, and conducted an aggressive, sometimes successful foreign policy. Nabis freed helots, expanded citizenship, and created a broader social base for Spartan power. He was eventually assassinated, and Sparta was absorbed more completely into the Roman orbit. The man who gave Sparta its last flicker of relevance was not a product of the agoge in any pure sense. He was a pragmatist who used the Spartan name and the Spartan army without being bound by the Spartan system. The legend outlasted the institution that had created it. Fact 76. The Spartans believed music could determine military outcomes. The Spartan use of flute music in battle was not a quirk. It reflected a genuine belief that rhythm, sound, and coordinated movement had power over human psychology and, by extension, over military outcomes. Spartan education included music not as an artistic pursuit but as a martial one. The right music at the right tempo could keep men calm, could prevent the panic that broke formations, could make the advance feel inevitable rather than terrifying. Sparta also used music in its festivals and rituals for similar reasons: to regulate emotional states, to create collective experience, to bind individuals into a unified body. The flutes at Leuctra played the same notes they had played at Thermopylae. The formation those notes were meant to hold simply did not hold. But the belief in music's power was not wrong. It had worked for 200 years. It just could not work forever. Fact 77. Sparta's greatest legacy is a silence we are still filling. In the end, what Sparta left the world was not a text, not a building, not a philosophical system. It left a question. A question that every society that came after it has had to answer for itself: what is a person for? Is a person for the state? Is a person for themselves? Is discipline a form of freedom or a form of subjugation? Can a society built on terror produce genuine virtue? Can strength that is maintained by fear remain strength? Sparta answered these questions one way, completely, totally, for centuries. And then it stopped existing as a meaningful power. The answer it gave was not wrong in every respect. But it was not entirely right either. The silence Sparta left is still being interpreted. Philosophers fill it. Politicians fill it. Filmmakers fill it. And historians, carefully, try to find beneath the silence the actual voices, the boys in the rushes, the women managing the estates, the helots in the dark, that Sparta itself never allowed to speak. The mountains are still there. The Taygetus range rises from the Eurotas Valley just as it rose when the first Spartan boys were taken from their homes at 7 and sent into a system that would consume 23 years of their lives. The valley is quiet now. Oranges grow where the training grounds were. The river runs as it always ran. The stones of the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia sit in partial excavation, returned partially to the light after centuries underground. What Sparta was, in the end, was an experiment. A sustained, serious, centuries-long attempt to answer a question that no civilization has ever fully answered: whether human beings can be made into something more than they are by nature. By engineering their environment from birth, by controlling every variable, by eliminating everything that is weak or uncertain or soft. The experiment produced extraordinary results for a time. Men who did not break under conditions that broke everyone else. A culture that made the rest of the ancient world simultaneously admire and fear it. A military force so psychologically formidable that its reputation alone sometimes won battles. And then it ended. Not in a single catastrophic moment, but slowly, the citizen body shrinking year by year, the system becoming unable to sustain itself, the rigid institutions failing to adapt, the helots eventually freed, the walls eventually built, the name eventually a relic kept alive for Roman tourists and philosophers looking for examples. What we are left with is the silence Sparta always preferred. A silence full of red cloaks and long hair and flutes and boys in the rushes cutting their beds for the night and the sound of feet moving in step across rocky ground toward something that had not yet been decided. History is always larger than any single story we tell about it. The Sparta of legend is real, but it is real the way a shadow is real. The actual thing that cast it was more complicated, more human, more strange, and in some ways more disturbing than the shadow suggests. You have been inside that story tonight. All 77 pieces of it. Sleep well.